You're listening to a 3CR podcast of independent community radio station 3CR in Melbourne, Australia.
Radio MMT respectfully acknowledges the traditional custodians of the land from which we are broadcasting, the Wurundjeri people, and we are broadcasting to the Kulin Nations. Our focus is economics, that is, how stuff is produced and distributed. We recognise that for many tens of thousands of years, First Nations people's connection to country successfully embodied the world's oldest continuous economy, which was catastrophically disrupted by genocide and displacement. We acknowledge that we have much to learn to reshape our current extractive and exploitive system to achieve sustainable prosperity for everyone.
Radio MMT. Economics for the rest of us with Anne
and Kev.
Radio MMT.
Looking at the world through the lens of modern monetary theory.
Radio MMT. Macroeconomics for a well-being economy.
Macroeconomics? Isn't that incredibly boring?
No, Kevin, it's incredibly interesting. It's all about who gets what and why.
Who gets what and why? Okay, I'm in.
RadioMMT@gmail.com.
Incredibly interesting macroeconomics for the rest of us. Welcome to another episode of Radio MMT. How are you this week, Anne?
Hello, Kevin. I'm good. I've been wondering how you are in your little corner of the job market.
Yeah, I'm sort of, I've had a bit of time off and I've been enjoying it.
Nice. Yes,
fixing things. It's always good to get stuff up to speed.
Doing work for yourself.
Yeah, if I was full-time employed, it's kind of like January, where you sit there and you go, okay, well, we haven't got a lot of actual work to do, but what do we need done around the place? So that's what I've been doing.
A handyman's work is never done.
True, correct. Hey, so recently we spoke with John and Martha.
Martha Knox-Haly and John Haly.
Okay, I don't know where you get these people from, Anne. Who are John and Martha? Why are we speaking to them?
Well, John and Martha are a husband and wife team that over the years have spent a lot of time looking into this phenomenon, our favourite thing, Kevin, unemployment. And I came across John and Martha via other students of the economics course that is run by Stephen Hale and co at Modern Money Lab.
Rightio, so they're via the Modern Money Lab mob, we should call them, because there are a mob of them now. Yeah. It's a very handy resource of people from different fields. I didn't know where John and Martha came from, but I did realise after we spoke to them that they were very knowledgeable. Yeah. Yeah,
well, thanks to the course, I think we might just go through the class one student at a time. Well, we did have such a very interesting and involved conversation with John and Martha, so much so that we will air it over 2 episodes of Radio MMT. And in this conversation, what we were essentially asking ourselves was, what is the real level of unemployment in Australia, and what is the cost of all this unemployment to unemployed individuals themselves, and what is the cost of unemployment to the economy as a whole, and is it possible to actually have no involuntary unemployment, and what will we need to do to have a full employment economy? And Kevin, if we could find the answers to all these questions, I think we will have reached the holy grail of macroeconomics.
Well, I reckon we do have a lot of the answers to a lot of these questions. It's just
spoiler alert.
The people making decisions aren't listening. We used to talk about this a lot more in our previous incantation on unemployed workers fight back, because unemployment was the central theme to that show, if some of our long-time listeners who might have listened to that. And we've sort of wandered off a bit, but it's nice to get back to the unemployment issue, because it is the foundation upon which the rest of the economy rests.
Exactly.
If your base level of employment is sound and healthy, then your economy will be sound and healthy. And so when you realise that unemployment is a choice, and it depends on government policy, that it's not just is beyond our control.
Just an act of nature.
It changes the perspective on this, but we seem to have lost this perspective. And with speaking with John and Martha, we had some interesting insights as to the history of that and how it occurred.
Well, let's head to our conversation with John and Martha. Today we are speaking with husband and wife team, John Haly and Martha Knox-Haly. John and Martha, welcome to you both.
Thank you.
Lovely to be here, thank you.
And you know, I get the feeling that you two make a terrific tag team when it comes to the issue of unemployment. Unemployment is such a dry term. You see the headlines, unemployment is up, unemployment is down. But I think that unemployment is anything but a dry issue. And in fact, it's the site of intense class struggle. So each of you have such a huge and impressive bio in this area and others. So I might ask you each to introduce yourselves. John, I might start with you because I was so pleased to see that you call yourself a socialist. And one of the things I've found in my travels is that the socialists are not always friendly to MMT or somewhat dismissive of it.
Well, there's a fascinating book called Fiat Socialism written by a socialist, which is all about MMT. And he says very early on in the book he doesn't understand why Marxists didn't leap on MMT the moment that Nixon decided in 1971 to get rid of the gold standard and move to fiat economies. It's a complete mystery to him. But yes, I was introduced to MMT back in 2017 when I spent 2.5 years on the executive of an MMT-based policy development group, which was booting a political platform. Unfortunately, due to a lack of public interest, the Real Democracy Party, it never became a registered party, and in mid-2019 dissolved.
Hey, were you aware of another party around that time called the Australian Workers' Party?
Oh, yes, very much so. Yes, Australian Workers' Party was the first sort of socialist party that I ever met that introduced MMT. They were my first choice as a party because
Excellent policies.
excellent policies, that sort of thing.
We liked their policies and we're below the line voters.
and yes, we're below the line voters.
I'll give you some background. I ran as in the Senate ticket for the Australian Workers' Party and helped develop some of their policies.
Oh, good.
And such as history.
Well, John, is there anything else you'd like to say about your encounters with MMT before I ask Martha a similar question?
Well, basically, I did the Modern Monetary Theory, Economics of the 21st Century course with Bill Mitchell. I eventually approached Stephen Hale, and Stephen said, oh, by the way, I'm running this MMT master's degree. Would you be interested? And I said, yeah, I want to do this degree. So I'm a little more than halfway through it at the moment.
Yeah, Stephen's course, which is run through Modern Money Lab, really is the hotbed in Australia for creating professionals who've got the MMT understanding.
Oh, yes.
So Martha, my understanding is that you have a pretty informed critique of neoliberalism, not least because you yourself have a PhD in economics, which doesn't always qualify someone, I think, to be a critic of the mainstream economics. And I also feel that's just the tip of the iceberg of your academic interests. So tell us a bit of the Martha story.
Okay, so the way that I earn a living is that I'm a clinical and an organisational psychologist. I have dual specialisations. My interest in unemployment began back in 1989 when my first thesis was looking at the reactions of South Coast trade unions to the introduction of award restructuring and multi-skilling. And it was as though I was being followed around by the then Greiner government, who was trying to sack all my subject sample. So I got an up-close and really intense exposure to what job loss actually meant for people. The way that it literally destroyed families on the South Coast in Wollongong. The way that workers would be told on their way into work, they'd hear it on the radio that they'd been sacked.
Oh.
That's how little respect people were treated with back then. So that really made me have an emotional commitment to, ensuring that this didn't happen to other people. My next area of research was basically a master's. in the area of applied and industrial psychology, and I was looking at gender differences in reaction to unemployment. So I was going to job skills clubs all across Sydney, and this was during the 1990 recession. And I was encountering situations where you'd have multiple generations of workers in the one job club. You'd have grandparents, you'd have parents, you would have children, all of whom had a long background of working in manufacturing. And because the way our economy was being restructured, families were being exposed to unemployment. And it was just devastating. And from then on, I've basically been working as a registered psychologist since 1996, helping people navigate challenges of mental health in workplaces. And it's the quality of jobs. It's not just any job that's important.
John, you've been writing various articles about the facts and figures on the state of unemployment in Australia. And those facts and figures might look a little different from the headlines we see in the mainstream media. In volumes 15 and 16 of the ERA Review, which is a journal published by Economic Reform Australia, you had a two-part paper titled Choosing Unemployment, What of Job Seekers? And in that paper, you begin with quite a bold claim in which you say, unemployment is a choice made by governments, corporations and central banks. Now, John, surely unemployment is the fault of individuals?
Not really. Most of the job vacancies that exist in the market, in theory, are in the highly educated, highly specialised areas. People talk about, just get any job. Well, there just aren't any jobs available. I mean, we live in a vast country in which we're spread literally around the outside of the country. Locality is always an issue. Skills is always an issue. There are a number of issues that get in the way of getting a job. If you, and I've worked this out statistically, if there are 100 jobs available where you're living, you're probably living in a city. If you're living in a regional area, you're lucky if there's a few. Statistically, there were 230,000 job vacancies available in Australia, but 1.3 million people unemployed. In terms of unemployment, and I'm talking about real unemployment, not the ABS measure.
Actually, we might go into that. I would be very interested to learn more about the way you dispute the ABS figures, which of course are handed to the rest of us as the official unemployment rates.
Well, I've learnt over time looking into this that I don't so much dispute that ABS doesn't produce unemployment figure that works for the methodology they use, and it works for the class. There's unemployment in terms of the working class, and there is unemployment in terms of capital. Capital is interested in employees that are instantly available, that are desperately looking for work. What ABS measures is it's a subset of the unemployed, which is roughly around 500,000, although that's now growing. So the methodology is aimed at employers. It's saying there are 500,000 people in Australia that desperately want work. They may not have the skills, they may not have the education, they may have all the other sort of problems that Martha deals with on a regular basis with all her clients. But basically, the interesting thing that I've learned over years of tracking this is that the number of vacancies doesn't change very much. The number of unemployed, crisis is aside, doesn't tend to change very much unless you change aspects of the economy, which they have done, which is why unemployment's going up. It was stable for nearly 2 years at about 500,000. I mean, I know people will say, it's 4.1, it's 4.2, it's 3.7, whatever. The numbers were about, from about 22 onwards, were about 500,000. And it's an estimate, but then so is Roy Morgan's an estimate. But what isn't an estimate is job seeker. Job seeker is a count of how many people are applying for unemployment benefits.
True, yeah.
ABS is about 2/3 of that count.
Wow.
Their measure is about 2/3 of that account.
How do you explain that the number of people receiving job seeker is higher than what the ABS is saying is the unemployment rate?
Always been higher.
One of the factors that leads to this difference between job seeker versus people seeking employment is apparent when we look at the data from the Hilda survey. That's the Household and Labour Dynamics data. And what we have is that an average of 23% of unemployed people transition into employment each month. But a further 21% of unemployed people give up looking for jobs.
Wow.
So what that means is that just under half the unemployed are remaining from month to month. And the long-term unemployed, who tend to have been without jobs for more than 12 months, they tend to be male. They've got less than year 12 education. They come from agriculture, manufacturing, retail. So they're regionally based. And that those long-term unemployed, and this is really critical, have half the chance of finding a job within a given month as a short-term unemployed person. Conversely, the long-term unemployed are twice as likely to leave the job market. So these are the people who just give up because it's too hard, because the structural factors of geography, industry, age, access to skill preservation, i.e. active labour market training programs, such as access to TAFE, it's too hard for them to keep going. It's too discouraging.
So what you're saying is that these people who are discouraged, they will be claiming the unemployment benefit, so they will be on job seeker.
Yes.
But if they happen to get surveyed by the ABS and they happen to be very honest when they ask them, are you currently seeking work, they might say no.
That's exactly right. So what's happening is employers are getting flooded with masses of useless job applications. So their systems are being clogged up because
they've got to meet the job seeker requirement. Yeah,
exactly. So it's creating an administrative burden for employers. It's not actually helping job seekers getting into jobs because it's not dealing with the structural causes of unemployment. And those structural causes of unemployment are government's failure to actively take the full responsibility that is required for running a labour market. Now, why they're refusing to take responsibility, I think it comes back to fear, because I think that they will then have to challenge this idea that you have to fight inflation by having a measure of unemployment, which gets back to all of our MMT propositions. The government would actively have to fight 40 years worth of policy, economic policy around financial deregulation, not providing stable careers in the public sector. That's going to take a very brave government to challenge and overturn 40 years of policy.
You're listening to 3CR 855 AM on digital and on the internet. www.3cr.org.au.
So, Kevin, before I got into MMT, it made no sense to me that when people would say, oh, the government should be creating more jobs, because it just seemed illogical to me. It was sort of like saying, you know, schools should be responsible for when kids have their bedtime. No, it seemed like to me, even if you could just create jobs out of thin air, and I didn't believe that, that it shouldn't be the government doing it. You'd think that it would be happening in the private sector.
Yeah, that's kind of our neoliberal culture, isn't it? You know, we've been brought up in an era where we've been told that the private sector is where all the activity should occur. So we're all subject to that influence.
Yeah, I swallowed that one.
Yeah.
But then when you get into MMT, it becomes obvious that it's the federal government that controls the unemployment rate. And it becomes even more clearer than John Maynard Keynes, who was the economist who understood that aggregate demand in the economy determines the unemployment rate. And it's even more clear than Menzies, who we were talking about, the Liberal Prime Minister, who actually at one point tried to use the government to increase unemployment in the 1950s, because MMT makes it clear that it is monetary systems that create unemployment by design, because the currency issuers are in charge of the monetary system, and only the federal government has the spending capacity to create as many jobs as needed. So nowadays, I judge a government as to whether or not they're good economic managers by looking at whether or not we have full employment. And by that I mean true full employment, in that there is no involuntary unemployment, and not this sort of mealy-mouthed full employment of 4%, which the RBA continues to inflict upon us all.
There were some interesting comments made during the interview about the measurement of unemployment. And, of course, we have these unemployment rates now that count somebody who's working for 1 hour a week as employed, which is just ridiculous. And a far more accurate way of regarding unemployment is how many hours of underutilised labour is out there. If somebody's working an hour a week, they've probably got another 35 that they'd like to be working. And there was the comment that John and Martha made about job seeker. If you want to have a proper look at the under and unemployed, just look at who's on job seeker. There's a straight record of it. It's right there.
Yes.
There's the government's record of what they're paying to people who are working so little that they are relying on job seeker, which is half for somebody to get by on. We have all these fanciful ways of calculating it. Just have a look at who's on the records. That's pretty simple.
Look at who's on the books.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's, what did they say? It was about 30% more people claiming job seeker than what the ABS is saying are unemployed.
Yeah, now how can you have this mismatch? You've got a straight record of who's claiming unemployment benefits. Just have a look at that. That is your unemployment level. That's
right, yeah.
Yeah, and that probably doesn't even cover it, because there'll be some people who are in such abject poverty that they're not even on unemployment benefits for one reason or another, you know?
That's right. So there's lots of hidden unemployment out there.
Yeah.
When you start to look at it, it really seems like we're operating in this nasty, brutal regime that's justifying its wicked ways with all these economic theories, like this thing called the Nehru, which we will talk about in a little bit.
Yeah, it's a very profit-driven view of how we're supposed to provision ourselves and regard ourselves. You know, there's a lot of activities that people are involved in now that could and should be classified as work and could and should be paid at the minimum wage, and that's where we start talking about the job guarantee and the opportunities that exist there.
The private sector just doesn't provide enough jobs.
Martha Knox-Haly and John Haly.
I mean, you've got unemployment, according to Roy Morgan, in June 2024 was 1.3 million, which is 5.7 times the advertised vacancies from the private or public sector. So, you know, the responsibility for employment ought to be with government, as with the idea of a job guarantee. And the government has, since unfortunately the days of Whitlam during the oil crisis, basically began abandoning its workers and its commitment to full employment policies. The full employment policies that were built by Curtin back in 1945, passed on to Ben Chifley, and then Menzies continued. And 25 years later, we had dominantly under 2% unemployment because the government and society had a commitment to employing people. Until Whitlam came along, and he decided that the oil crisis was such that he couldn't continue to support full employment policies, and he started reducing tariffs. Hawke came along with the Accord, and basically he made deals with the unions before he became Prime Minister, which were enacted the moment he did become Prime Minister. There's an excellent book by Elizabeth Humphrys.
How Labour Built Neoliberalism.
That's the one. Labour, not Labor, not the party, but how the unions aided neoliberalism. The neoliberal mantra, as I look at it, is a perversion of capitalism, which started back in April of 1975 when Friedman rocked up in Australia and talked to the Reserve Bank and talked to members of the Labor government at the time. Interestingly enough, despite the fact that Whitlam made certain choices that he did, Whitlam would not talk to Friedman.
Oh, really? I've been curious about that whole little scenario, the Friedman visit.
I was fascinated by the fact that Whitlam would not talk to him.
Yes.
But everyone else in the RBA and his party would talk to Friedman. So,
oh, dear.
I often think, as much as it was the Whitlam government that started this, what Elizabeth Humphrys calls proto-neoliberalism, was it really him or was it his party that was pushing? Because he did not want to speak to Friedman, which I just find fascinating.
I think that's very telling. Yeah.
Yes, it's very fascinating. I mean, I think he was a great man because he did a number of great things. Really only two mistakes, and that was deteriorating wages and deteriorating tariffs.
Right. Actually, can you quickly explain how do tariffs contribute to higher rates of unemployment?
Well, tariffs basically protect budding industries. The thing is that you can't build a manufacturing sector without some form of tariffs or subsidisation. There is no car industry anywhere in the world that is not in some way subsidised or protected by tariffs.
Okay.
Car manufacturing simply doesn't work. I mean, we whinged in Australia about subsidising car manufacturing, but the thing is that our subsidisation of the car industry was fairly small compared to other countries.
Oh, okay.
It was just, the usual neoliberal objection to unions and paying a fair wage.
So by having a tariff, which is a tax on the similar equivalent imported good,
yes,
then you're protecting your local industry, and by protecting your local industry, you're protecting local jobs. Is that how it works?
That is correct.
Right.
Tariffs basically protect jobs.
It's interesting when you think of what was happening at the time. I mean, obviously you had Reagan and Thatcher were fully embracing neoliberalism.
Yes.
And yet it was Hayden under the Whitlam government that started introducing the policies of Milton Friedman into the economic discussion. And you're saying it was Hawke and Keating that really kind of polished off this shift towards neoliberal ideology in their economic platform. It seems unreal that it's the Labor governments that really entrench this.
Well, it's the Labor governments that started. It's the Liberal governments that, as I often use the phrase, Labor opens the door up a little to just ease off a bit of the pressure, and the Liberal government comes along and swings it wide open.
Right.
So by the time you get to Howard, he's saying, you started all this, so we're just going to finish you all off. So he started on the deterioration of the apprenticeship systems, the deterioration of the education systems, made us more reliant on migrants for skills because basically education was no longer free. We have this weird obsession with having surpluses. Menzies used to boast about having a deficit. I can produce articles where he boasted about how he maintained deficits.
How quickly we forget.
But now the Conservatives on both parties are all talking about wanting to maintain surpluses.
It's really interesting. When you look at the whole platform of neoliberalism, it's a very deliberate government choice that was pursued by the top 19 OECD democracies around whether unemployment was going to be pursued versus whether inflation was going to be mistakenly fought through interest rate increases. These are deliberate policy choices. And historically, accords never work well for labour movements. So when the US unions signed a labour accord in 1948, that was the start of them beginning to give away their power and beginning to crumble. So people lose perspective of the fact that there are different power blocks with different agendas that must be pursued clearly. Consensus is always helpful. You need consensus at the end of the day, but you need to have quite clear-cut understandings that there are different agendas that need to be pursued. And when labour movements lose that perspective, and I think they did begin to lose this perspective with the 1983 Accord, that was the start of labour markets really deteriorating in terms of skill formation. Historically, apprenticeships were developed through the public sector manufacturing workplaces. That's where we got our supply of skilled trades from. And I think that this is why we have such a problem with labour market formation at the moment, where our supply of skilled trades is unpredictable because we've left it up to the private sector. This is a mistake. It has to be under the remit of government.
When training is left to the private sector, when there are subsidies given to private firms,
a disaster.
All that happens is that they train up staff and they're then pilfered by other firms. And so what's the point?
Yep.
So trying to get private firms to train up is never going to work.
It's never worked. Historically in Australia, it has never worked when you leave it up to the private sector, because the majority of the private sector are these tiny, teeny workplaces that don't have the cash to spend money on good, deep skill formation. And we also end up with this terribly fragmented labour market that we've got in Australia, a fragmented labour market where employers can get some of the skills that they need some of the time, and employees can get some of the jobs that they want some of the time. But because there's no centralised steering mechanism, it's very hit and miss. And it's very hard for young people to know how to get an entry in. And it's extremely difficult for older workers to sustain secure employment. So it's a very wasteful, very inefficient way of running labour market policy.
When you talk about a fragmented job market, what does that fragmented mean?
There's a combination of factors that basically resulted in dismantling education and apprenticeship systems. The public sector used to have 4-year apprenticeships for building trades, which was basically replaced under Howard by shallow 16-week CBT courses, which is the bare minimum for a particular role. So basically, there is such a shortage of skills in this country because we rely on training by competency-based training courses rather than full apprenticeships where you learn everything. So there was a disaggregation of skills which modernised and atomised that will ultimately leave skills fragmented at their core. So that meant their training is, as Martha has pointed out, quite insufficient.
Just with the public service training, I'm old enough to remember some people who used to work for organisations like Telecom or the Melbourne Board of Works or the SEC.
Yeah.
And the people that were trained up under that system, metal workers and electricians, etc., because they're government organisations and profit is not such an issue, you hear all this talk about time wasted, etc., but their workmanship was spectacular. You put that under a private system and it's driven by the profit margin and it's got to be done quickly and just get the hell out of there because time is money, and it's reflected in the quality of the work.
Yeah, this is a real problem for us as a country because right now we don't have the skills trades base to implement the new technologies that are coming through with sustainable economies. You can see this happening with the Mike's Cannon Brooks Sunlink project where, you don't have enough underwater cabling specialists. You can see this with Sydney Water's recent efforts to introduce hydroloops, which are a very technically complex grey water system, which is essential for conserving water under drought conditions. It's been enormously difficult for Sydney Water to actually get the plumbers that they need to install these systems. So this is now catching up with us as a country.
You're with Anne and Kev on Radio MMT.
At 3CR Community Radio in Melbourne, Australia.
And wherever you get your podcasts.
Economics for the rest of us. Martha mentioned how working class power was undermined when the unions lost sight of the different power blocks with different agendas. And they lost sight of this in this effort to reach a consensus. In other words, they lost sight of the primacy of the class conflict. And when Martha mentioned this, my thoughts went to an interview I heard recently with the Labour Party's current Federal Treasurer, Jim Chalmers. And this was an interview from the 23rd of August 2023 on an episode of the Morning Edition with Jacqueline Maley. And it was titled Inside Politics, Treasurer Jim Chalmers. And in that interview, Chalmers talked a lot about his efforts to build consensus with the shadow treasurer of the Liberal Party over the review of the RBA, the Reserve Bank of Australia, our central bank. And of course, in the interview, Chalmers said almost nothing about representing the interests of workers. But I thought it was a good demonstration of different power blocks with different agendas, as Martha was talking about, because the way I see it, you've got the government with their agenda and workers with their agenda and capital with their agenda. And here's an example of the government being more oriented towards their fellow politicos over there in Canberra than towards those whose lives are so affected by all of their decision-making.
From the newsrooms of the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age, this is Inside Politics. I'm Jacqueline Maley and it is Friday, August the 23rd. Today is a very special episode of Inside Politics because we are interviewing the Treasurer, Jim Chalmers.
Yeah, we are still engaging with the Shadow Treasurer and I'm grateful for that engagement. There's a fair amount of things that I disagree with Angus Taylor about, but I think in fairness, his instincts and his intentions on Reserve Bank reform are broadly the right ones. I've engaged with him in good faith and I believe he's engaged with me in good faith on Reserve Bank reform. Angus Taylor has raised with me probably half a dozen areas where there are potential choices to be made or potential areas of disagreement. There have been about half a dozen. And in every single instance, all 6 of those instances, I've accommodated his view. And wherever there have been 50-50 calls to be made or wherever the Shadow Treasurer has had a strong view, I've accommodated his view. He wanted to be sure that the Governor was the chair of the Governance Board. We've made that possible. He wanted there to be flexibility in the term limits. We've done that. He was worried about how we described the dual mandate in terms of equal weight between price stability and employment. And we've accommodated his view, not just in the legislation, but also in the statement of conduct.
I think the most important thing Chalmers said in this interview is something that would have completely gone over my head before I got into MMT. And this was in his reference to his negotiations with the Shadow Treasurer Angus Taylor. And Jim Chalmers said, Angus was worried about how we described the dual mandate in terms of equal weight between price stability and employment. And we've accommodated his view, not just in the legislation, but also in the statement of conduct. So, of course, that made me think, what on earth is this statement of conduct? And I think I found it. And even though there's actually not a whole lot of room for disagreement between Labor and Liberal on this, given that the review of our central bank was mostly window dressing, as described by Bill Mitchell in his blog post from November 29, 2023, which he titled Changes to RBA Act will further entrench the depoliticisation of economic policy and reduce democratic accountability. So obviously Bill was not very impressed with that review. But when I looked up this statement of conduct, which is apparently a common understanding of the Reserve Bank Board and the government on these key aspects of Australia's monetary and central banking policy framework, in this statement of conduct, what they say is the government's objective is sustained and inclusive full employment where everyone who wants a job can find one without searching for too long, Kevin. That's exactly what they say. I don't know what their definition of too long is.
Yeah.
And the Reserve Bank Board and the government agree that the Reserve Bank Board's role within this is to focus on achieving sustained full employment, which is the current maximum level of employment that is consistent with low and stable inflation. So that's a really good example of when you drill down into these things and you get to see whose agenda is what. And at the moment, Liberal and Labor have the same agenda of keeping a bunch of people unemployed.
That's an interesting place to arrive at. And this was part of the discussion where we saw the Whitlam government beginning to veer towards neoliberalism and taking the ideas of Milton Friedman seriously. Now, I guess it's hard back in the day talking about the very gestation period of neoliberalism coming into our economy, and we sit back 40 years later and go, that was terrible, and how could the Whitlam government possibly have become involved in that?
We've got the benefit of hindsight.
Hindsight is definitely part of it. However, it was also interesting in that interview to hear that Whitlam would not speak to Friedman.
Yes.
And it was more Hayden. So back during that period, it was enormously disruptive. Whitlam's come into power in 1972. Up until that stage, you're still pretty much in the very stable post-war period. And then the next thing you know, you've got the oil shock, inflation running out of control, the wheels are beginning to fall off, cracks appearing everywhere, and you've got a government that is not used to this kind of economic strife. Everything had been very stable before then. So somebody comes in with a theory and they're sounding pretty confident, they're going to get a listen. And it was also interesting listening to John, who said that what happens is that Labor opens the door a crack to have a look to see what's going on, and they lose power, and the next thing you know, you've got it was Fraser that came in after that. He was right in alignment with Reagan and Thatcher in terms of booting that door wide open. By the time you got Hawke and Keating coming in, they're sort of scratching around, having a bit more of a look, and then we have Howard, and the door's just kicked off its hinges. And
yeah, that's right. There is no door anymore.
Neoliberalism, here we are, and the consequences of Howard's policies, being in government for so long, have been drastic and still weigh heavily.
Yeah,
and he normalised this brutal regime.
That's the problem, isn't it? Because the third step in all of that is that it's very hard to wind it back again. And that's where we are now, having such trouble winding back all these neoliberal policies.
You almost have to have a catastrophe of some sort. It has to be like an emergency, as happened during COVID, where you saw this enormous reversal of fiscal policy by a Liberal government. Mm-hmm. There's an emergency and they reverse their ideology and they take this drastic action. That's what it takes. For people to look at things through a different lens, to see what other options they have available.
Yeah. Well, in the next episode of Radio MMT, we will be looking at what we would do if there was such a catastrophe, Kevin, and we got to put the door back on its hinges, because we will be looking at all the different policies that go into making a full employment economy. It's an interesting one to ask yourself, well, why is it that you can sometimes have very low rates of unemployment and also very low rates of inflation? And what everyone seems to be pointing to is this issue of skills formation in the workforce. I mean, it kind of makes sense. If you think about what barriers people have to gaining employment, if you don't have the skills that an employer is looking for, then you're going to have trouble getting work. And so it makes sense to me that during the 60s and 70s and back even to the 50s, when the government was also taking responsibility to make sure people were getting properly trained, that as a result we also had low unemployment. And effectively what you've got left are people with the other kinds of barriers, things like homelessness or drug addictions. And that's where, I imagine if we dealt with homelessness as a society, we would probably have even lower rates of unemployment.
Yeah, and as was mentioned during the interview, leaving training up to the private sector is doomed to failure every time. And there's a few reasons for that. One reason is that it costs, and private firms are going to be reluctant to spend on anything which isn't directly profitable. If a private firm does train somebody up, it just makes them more poachable by another firm. The other thing is, and I've noticed this quite a lot, I work a bit in the building trade, and I see a lot of people doing their apprenticeships these days, and they'll do their apprenticeship on some of these large-scale apartment buildings, etc. They'll do one thing over and over again because essentially they're an apprentice, they're on a low wage, it's a large-scale operation, and all they learn is basically a very limited scope of what they're supposed to learn in their apprenticeship. They come out knowing very little.
That's because they're working for private employers who are worrying about their bottom line, whereas if they were working in the public service, the public service can say what we're trying to do is produce a really well-rounded apprentice.
Yeah, if you have profit-driven training, it's always going to be compromised.
Right.
Back in the day when you had government organisations like the Board of Works and the SEC and all of these state-run enterprises that took on apprentices, they're not profit-driven. And the older guys in those organisations had a lot of pride in their work, and they would train their apprentices up fastidiously. There's all these stories about, isn't that good enough? And no, it's got to be perfect. That just doesn't happen in the private sector.
So in this next segment with Martha and John, we will be talking about a couple of things called the NAIRU or the NAIRU or the NERU, however you say it, and we compare that with the neighbour. Now, both of these things are acronyms. So we've got the NAIRU, which is the non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment.
And then we have the NAIBER, and I've forgotten what that is. Anne, talk me through that one.
NAIBER. We don't hear about it so often because it is an invention of Professor Bill Mitchell, who is one of the co-founders of modern monetary theory. But this is his alternative way of managing the economy so that you don't have to make people unemployed and suffering in poverty. And so the NAIBER is the non-accelerating inflation buffer employment ratio.
Radio.
Let's head to our conversation with Martha Knox-Haly and John Haly. These policies that, Martha, you're saying we need to get brave and ditch, basically.
Yeah.
But
like yesterday.
So it is the NAIRU that they're using to deliberately keep a level of unemployment in the economy. And in fact, Kev and I were discussing the NAIRU recently, and we've become a bit confused about it because we're trying to understand, is the NAIRU a thing or is it not a thing? Because recently we actually were speaking with Phil Lawn, who's an economist in Adelaide.
Yeah.
And he was telling us that you only use a job guarantee or a buffer stock of employed people when you get to the NAIRU. And I'm like, oh, I thought the NAIRU wasn't a thing.
So the government, the majority of the time, has to run deficits to help us to save and to achieve full employment. And it can do that with a job guarantee. Until you hit the NAIRU, if there's unemployment, the government should not be paying people who are unemployed a minimum wage. They should be paying pretty much standard award wages because the inflationary pressure only arises when the unemployment rate goes below the NAIRU. They shouldn't be called job guarantee officers. They should be called full employment officers. And people file in, and whilst the unemployment rate's still above the NAIRU, you say, go over there, go over there, go over there. And people get jobs with the government at award wages. And as soon as you hit the NAIRU and people going over there would cause inflation, you go, okay, over there, over there, over there, and they get job guarantee jobs at the minimum wage. So if the NAIRU is, let's say, 4% and the unemployment rate is 6%, the government can reduce the unemployment rate from 6% to 4% by paying people award wages without it posing an inflationary risk because it's above the NAIRU. It quells the inflationary effect of reducing unemployment below the NAIRU.
But I thought the NAIRU didn't exist.
No, the NAIRU is real. The problem is the way mainstream economists use the NAIRU to control inflation. So the way mainstream economists use the NAIRU is they say, okay, say the NAIRU is 4%. Once the unemployment rate gets down to 4%, spending stops. Because if spending continues to increase, unemployment rate will go below 4%, you'll get inflation. We don't want inflation. So that 4% of the labour force become this sacrificial pool of unemployed people to control inflation.
Mm-hmm.
That's not saying that the NAIRU is not an important thing to consider when you're thinking about full employment policy. My view is that you use the NAIRU, that's when you say, when the government spends more money to bring the unemployment rate down even further to the full employment level, which might be, let's say, 1%. There's always some frictional unemployment, that's people going in and out of jobs. That's when people go on the job guarantee, on the minimum wage.
So it exists, but we shouldn't be using it to control inflation.
Well, you're going to have a NAIRU because to have no NAIRU means that you would have to perfectly match the demand for labour skills with the supply, and that's going to be impossible. We used to do a better job at it because we didn't have a job guarantee in the 50s and 60s, and we had pretty close to full employment, and we didn't have all these strong inflationary pressures.
Mm.
So what that meant was that in the 50s and 60s, the NAIRU was very, very low. It probably wasn't much higher than the frictional unemployment rate. And that's because we had better education and training systems that matched the skills that were being demanded by the public and the private sector with what was being supplied. So the high school I went to, in 1977 I started high school, I think 4 or 5 years prior, it was a boys' tech. So it changed in, I think, 1972 from a boys' tech to a co-ed high school. And, great thing about going to that high school, we had 2 woodwork workshops, 2 metalwork.
Oh, you were all kitted out, yep.
Oh, yeah, legacy of that era. But a lot of those kids that went to Mitchell Park Boys Tech, they went off and did an apprenticeship. And the apprenticeship scheme was great because the people who were funding apprenticeships were people in the private sector. And we knew that when that person was qualified, who was doing the apprenticeship, that would be someone with labour skills that would match labour demand, because the only reason why that person paid for that apprenticeship was because they wanted that person once they were qualified.
Mm.
So we got a better matching of labour skills, and now it's woeful. We have people working behind bars and as baristas who've got degrees in accountancy. So we've got mismatches in a way that we didn't before. The mismatches are more acute. The NAIRU is higher. And that's why, we hear economists say, once unemployment gets down to about 4%, we've got virtually full employment. They're really talking about the NAIRU, which is higher than it ought to be. So,
are you saying that the NAIRU's gone up because of the mismatch?
That definitely happened. So inflationary pressure when unemployment falls arises at a much higher unemployment rate today than it did in the 50s and 60s.
Okay. So is it a thing? Is it not a thing? And can you describe these 2 approaches, the NABER and the NAIRU, as far as managing the relationship between inflation and unemployment?
There is a NAIRU, but it's
an excessively conservative estimate
yes.
of the underlying rate of inflation. And Stephanie Kelton articulates this really well in The Deficit Myth. Basically, what it's saying is that if you spend too much money, you'll have inflation. The problem when you have an excessively conservative estimate of what the underlying inflation rate is, which is the NAIRU, is that you actually underspend and you release inadequate amounts of money into the economy, and that's when you have unemployment. So the problems start with the way we conceptualise inflation.
Yep. The trouble with the way the Nauru is constructed is that they believe that inflation is demand pull, and innumerable people have discussed that the inflation is supply push. Supply push can't be affected by interest rates, and the proposition that the RBA of raising interest rates yet again will just push us into recession.
So this is where we are looking at also the RBA as one of the
instigators,
the culprits,
yes,
as far as unemployment goes.
Well, I just don't. I used to work for the RBA. I worked on the Exchange Settlement Reserve System, which is RITS. We brought it back in-house. The computer systems that manage all the reserves was outsourced many years ago to a Australian company that was then taken over by a foreign enterprise. The RBA suddenly realised that it was a foreign company basically had control of the computer system that managed the reserves for the entire Australia.
Oh my gosh.
Back in 2002 when I worked for the RBA, they basically moved $9 to $16 billion worth of transactions a day between the bank's accounts. The reserves are how money is transferred between banks. They thought maybe we should have that in-house. So I basically wrote the security and operations systems. We had to reverse engineer because they wouldn't give us the computers back because they said we own them.
So, John, why don't you go ahead and explain the different approaches, the neighbour and the Nauru?
The fundamental difference between a neighbour and a Nauru is the person that you're trying to attract employed or not. So as a private employer, you're either pulling your employees from an unemployed market or you're pulling them from an employed market. The Nauru thinks that it's a good idea to have a pool of unemployed people so that you can easily get them in. You can pay them even less than minimum wages, which is a distinct issue in the services industries, which they get away with. The neighbour says, no, you need your buffer stock of people to be employed so that they're not walking into your place depressed because they spent the last 6 months being unemployed, that they're just moving from a job guarantee to private employment. If you have a job guarantee, which is the proposal Bill Mitchell puts forward, then you have to, as an employer, provide better conditions and presumably better money, which means that private organisations are forced to have to pay at a rate higher than the minimum wage. So you're seeking to attract someone over to your job, then you can just say, oh, Joe over there is offering me a better job, I'm going over there. And so you take up that job. And the job guarantee doesn't mind losing you because it's only there as a growing and shrinking pool of employed people that the private sector is pulling from. A buffer stock of people you can draw from. So it's about where do you pull your buffer stock of people?
We talk about the Nauru and it's described as a demand-side solution to what seems to be a supply-side problem. We have inflation caused by supply-side problems. We're using a demand-side solution through the Nauru. We say that if we keep enough people unemployed, it will put downward pressure on wages and that will address inflation, even though that's not what's causing inflation. We understand the relationship between unemployment and price. That's what we're talking about here. It appears to me that the Nauru is more of a smokescreen to what must be very enticing for anybody who is trying to make a profit, which is to say that really it keeps profits high. They say it's inflation, but its real cause is if you put downward pressure on wages, it keeps profits high for firms.
This is absolutely right. And Bill Mitchell articulated this beautifully in his book about the role of the state, where he tracked the evolution of these policies, and they were driven by central bankers in Europe. So it comes from people who are interested in money but have a very parochial view that doesn't extend to the fact that you need to have a functional society to ultimately support profit making.
Here's an idea.
If you go to war on civil society, well, ultimately your ability to create profit will collapse.
I'm James Juniper. I'm an economist at the University of Newcastle, and you're listening to Radio 3CR.
On this issue of whether the Nauru is a thing or it isn't a thing, which I keep getting confused about, I think we're saying that the Nauru is correct in that we all agree that poverty does slow down the economy. So more unemployment does reduce inflation rates. But the Nauru is incorrect by going the reverse and saying, well, more employment's going to cause inflation. Because for one thing, inflation has many causes, and just doing this one thing of increasing interest rates to slow down the economy to make more people unemployed is not going to fight certain kinds of inflation. And we heard John mention two types of inflation, cost push and demand pull. And so demand pull being that prices increase due to total demand for goods and services exceeding production. In other words, blame the buyers or blame the workers. And then you have cost push inflation, in which prices increase due to cost of production going up. In other words, you blame the suppliers or you blame the capitalists. So, of course, there's that argument.
And we understand that if you increase unemployment, that it will, it's like dragging an anchor on the economy. Puts the brakes. It'll slow things down. But there's nothing to say that by increased employment that you're going to overheat the economy. There's no evidence of that. In fact, there's a lot of evidence to the contrary. As we saw during the 50s and the 60s, we had very low unemployment.
Yeah.
So governments pay attention to this thing called the Nauru, which is the first one we talked about. They said that there's a relationship between inflation and unemployment, and to keep inflation down, we need to keep unemployment up at a certain level, because that's going to put downward pressure on wages. You and I, Anne, have an enormous problem with this concept. We think it's cruel, we think it's unnecessary, we think it's fictional, because it bears little resemblance to the real figures in the real world. It seems to go up and down, and the conservatives, the orthodoxy, talk about the Nauru in some sort of retrospective fashion, and they make it fit post the exercise, which is to say it's never predictable. It's always retrospective, and it's inconsistent, and there's always excuses as to why it is working or it isn't working, which is why we think it's unreliable and a fiction.
So the Nauru is not really a thing because it isn't predictable. In other words, it's not going to predict what unemployment rate is going to coincide with what kind of accelerating inflation. And I've heard the MMT economists say, in fact, there is no unemployment rate that equates to an equilibrium in the economy. It's this mythical equilibrium that the mainstream economists are after.
So essentially, there's this theory that has its foundations in making sure that there's enough unemployment to put downward pressure on wages, and that will keep inflation under control. We've spoken about this before, Anne, and my suspicion is that it's hocus pocus, invented by the orthodoxy, not to keep inflation down, but to keep profits up. That there's an ulterior motive.
It's a smokescreen.
And I reckon there's far more evidence for that. The neighbour, the NAIBER.
The non-accelerating inflation buffer employment ratio.
Yeah, it basically takes the Nauru, turns it on its head, and says if you want to have a stable basis for employment, then the government should become involved and run a jobs guarantee program. The government should employ anybody who wants to work, employ them at the minimum wage, and if that's the foundation of your employment in your economy, it's going to have many, many beneficial effects. So essentially the Nauru is one that says let's use unemployment as a basis for our economy, and the other one says let's use employment, let's use gainful employment as the basis for our economy.
Yes, so whenever you're talking about unemployment, you always end up talking about inflation. And we all agree, the heterodox economists and the mainstream economists, we all agree that there is a relationship between unemployment and inflation. But the thing is, the mainstream economists, they weaponize this against us. And so what you end up with is, I think, the ruling class convincing themselves and everyone else that mass employment is this inevitable fact of life, as you were saying, when we say it's not inevitable. And it's something that these policymakers keep choosing to have. And in fact, in our next episode with John and Martha, we'll be talking about that alternative policy, which is the job guarantee.
So what we learned through this is that unemployment is a choice that the government can choose to address or ignore. And what we find is that the neoliberals tell us that unemployment is just a byproduct of the private sector and that the government should stay out of the way and let unemployment run its natural course, whatever that is. This is always to stop getting in the way of us making enormous profits with all of your equality and government interference.
Yeah, so I guess another way you could say is that the difference between the Nehru and the neighbour, it boils down to, do we want to manage the economy in the interests of workers, or do we want to manage the economy in the interests of capital?
Yeah, so the way we view unemployment via the Nehru, via this buffer stock of unemployed, is we look at unemployment as a benefit to firms, as a benefit to the capitalists, the people making money. So unemployment is viewed as a lever that can apply itself to firms and profit. So that view of unemployment is a very employer view of unemployment. The other way to look at unemployment is if you're unemployed, if you don't have enough work, if you're underemployed, and that view of unemployment says I'm available to do work, I want to do work, I need to do work, but you're not using me. And you've kept me out of the workforce because of some airy-fairy theory that you've got about inflation, which has really got to do with profits. And over the years, over the decades, we've even demonised to say that if somebody's not working, it's because they're lazy or they're not good enough or there's something wrong with them, rather than recognising that this is a policy choice by government. And I think that the true view of unemployment is as a wasted resource, as somebody who wants to work. And we used to understand unemployment from a far more empathetic point of view.
It's so wasteful and it's also unethical. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it's quite cruel, really. We don't care about the unemployed like we used to.
So we will return to our conversation with Martha Knox-Haly and John Haly in our next episode of Radio MMT. But in the meantime, we do have to get out of here.
Excellent. Well, we'll have to make way for Vicky coming through with Mafalda up next. Lovely to speak to you again, Anne. And let's do it again in 2 weeks' time.
See you then, Kevin. You've been listening to Radio MMT with Anne and Kev.
We'd love your feedback. Email us on radiommt@gmail.com or search Radio MMT on social media.
Listen to this show anytime wherever you get your podcasts or on 3cr.org.au/Radio MMT.
Support this show and the station by subscribing to 3cr.org.au and mention Radio MMT.
We thank all our guests.
And we thank economist Professor Bill Mitchell and his mmted.org, educating the masses on modern monetary theory.
And thank you to our listeners for listening. And I thank you, Kevin.
And I thank you, Anne. So what's planned for next week?
Kevin, there is still so much to talk about. We've got to expose all this rotten economics.
Well, no, that's good, and I get it. Do you reckon we could use a bit more music?
Well, I made a list of all these terrible economic theories. Like, I've heard of the theory of comparative advantage, or the quantity theory of money, or the loanable funds theory.
Have you heard of a band called Single Gun Theory? Like, they're a really good band. I'm sure there's a whole range of, like, macroeconomic music that I could bring into the show.
Yeah, but we really need to do marginal productivity theory, not to mention the natural rate of unemployment and the money multiplier.
You've got a pretty good singing voice. I play bass. Bill, he plays guitar. I reckon we could form a macroeconomics band. Like, we could deliver this whole message via music.
Well, we could call the band the Permanent Income Hypothesis, or the Ricardian Equivalence, or Rational Expectations.
I think we're onto something here. We're trying to make macroeconomics more interesting to the masses. We're going to, form this band and sing it to them. And we're going to bring the economists in. We're going to get musical.